Hey guys, welcome to How to Control What's Controlling You, getting to the root cause of stress and resilience. So this topic is super exciting for me because it's one of those areas of medicine that we don't talk a lot about, and we don't talk about the impact really of how stress affects your health and then what you can actually do about it. So by the end of this session, hopefully you will feel pretty confident about understanding your stress response, and then also how you can actually intervene for the purpose of living healthier for longer. All right, so I'm Dr. Nicole Peoples. I'm a board certified physician in internal medicine. I've been a practicing hospitalist, basically the type of doctor who takes care of you in the hospital. But I've also been trained in functional medicine as well as integrative holistic health. And my area of focus is typically women's health as it pertains to their hormones and longevity. So, what does that actually mean? It means that I prescribe health. And when I say that, I mean it exactly the way it sounds. I literally give prescriptions for the behaviors and the interventions one might need to take to stay healthy. And this is a very different way of approaching medicine, in that although understanding disease is really important, it's just one half of the puzzle. The other side of the puzzle is what actually keeps you healthy and what do you have to do to stay that way. And obviously, stress is a huge factor there. This is my framework, which I call the People's Life Prescriptions. And they're basically the areas where I find that people can influence their health through lifestyle. And as you can see, we have personal life, which has to do with mindset and intention, food life, which is nutrition, sleep, which is about sleep and rest, fit life, which is about movement, connected life is about connection with others, detox life is about toxin exposures, and then resilient life is about stress and resiliency. And so we're going to focus a lot here on resiliency and stress. But what's really important for you to understand is that all of these are interconnected. And that food impacts your resiliency, your mindset impacts your resiliency, your toxin exposure, as well as your connectedness with others, and movement and sleep all affect one another. So none of these act in isolation. And so we will talk about all of those as we go through. But before we get started, I think it's important to really give some groundwork, because a lot of people don't know what functional medicine is. And so I like to be the bearer of great news about the type of medicine that I practice. And really, functional medicine is an approach to healthcare that really thinks about the body as being interconnected as opposed to individual parts. And so in the conventional medical model, we really break things up into organ systems, like you have a cardiologist for your heart, you have a neurologist for your brain, and an endocrinologist for your hormones. But in functional medicine, we understand that all of those areas are connected, and we want to figure out what are the lifestyle choices, the environment, the genetics that you need to take into account that will influence the overall system as a whole, not just what are the foods that you can eat to impact the kidneys, but how do the foods you eat impact the entire body. And this is my favorite picture, because what this picture depicts is really the difference between conventional care and functional care. So conventional care are essentially the leaves on this tree, right? It's what we see, it's what we name, right? It's the part of the tree that flourishes or blossoms, or doesn't flourish or blossom, right? And a diseased tree isn't diseased because of its leaves, it's diseased because of what's in the roots. It's disease because something in the soil is not adequate. And so that is the same for the human body. When something is not right, it's not what you see, which is what's causing the problem. It is what is happening underneath in the soil. And so that's why I refer to functional medicine as root cause medicine, because we're looking at the roots, or the things that cause or lead to illness or health. So what are those things? Well, obviously, stress is one big one. We're going to talk a lot about that. Sleep, diet, trauma, your gut, your thoughts. And so you can see here in the roots that there's a relationship between the lifestyle prescriptions that I write for health and the root causes of illness. And we'll talk more about that as we go along, but this just gives you a quick overview. So what are we actually going to talk about today? We're going to talk about your personalized stress prescription. So how do we address stress in your individual body, and what are the factors that influence stress in you? That's specific to you, and then also what can you do about it. Now, there are a lot of generalized recommendations, and what I will be talking about is sort of general, but I want you, as we go through, to think about how this applies to you as an individual, and I'll give you some prompts for that as well. And if you have a sheet of paper or a pencil, there will be some opportunities for you to jot down some of your thoughts, and so if you have that on hand, I encourage you to have that ready so that you can write your own prescription by the end of this talk. So here's my other favorite image. So what you see here is a lion chasing a zebra. And zebras have evolved over time to handle stressful situations just like other animals. But what we're getting to in this picture is your primal response to stress. And it is pretty uniform across all species, that we all sort of have the same primitive response to a stressful situation. So as we can all agree, this poor zebra is in a very stressful situation. He's in a life or death situation. And what most of you have probably learned in the past about stress is the idea of fight or flight, right? This is a great picture of fight or flight. This zebra is not in a position to fight. He is flighting. He is running for his life. But what happens during this process in that zebra's body, that the chemical reactions or the hormonal interactions that are happening that cause this to happen is not unique to zebras. Like I said, it happens in all species, and it's very specific, and we call that response the sympathetic nervous system. Now we're going to talk a little bit about that today, and I hope not to get too technical, but I think understanding this sympathetic nervous system and what actually is happening here is actually quite important for you to understand what's happening in your own body when you were in a stressful situation and how you might manage that situation to benefit your overall health. Now, this is the part of the picture that most of us are focusing on, but this other part, the reason why I love this picture so much is if you notice at the top, there are some zebras that are just standing around watching. We're going to talk about them too, because they are the other side of this story. So let's talk about the zebra and the lion for a moment. So when you are under a stressful situation, or in this poor zebra's case, when he is in a stressful situation, what happens is that there are a bunch of chemical and hormonal reactions that happen in our bodies that allow us to protect our vitality. It's essentially that allow us to stay alive. It's protecting ourselves. And what happens is that our heart rate increases, our brain shuts off critical thinking, we might get anxious and nervous, your body is really focused on producing energy, and so in the form of blood sugar increases, your heart rate increases, your blood pressure increases, so that you can push all of the blood and the oxygen to your limbs, so that you can run or so that you can fight. And simultaneously, it shuts down other parts of your body that aren't as essential when you are in a life-threatening situation. So in that case, it will shut down your gut, right? So you don't need to be digesting food when you are about to become some poor lion's food. You do not need to produce sex hormones. You can shut down your sex hormone production if you are running away from a lion. And you might increase your inflammatory markers, because if you get bit by this lion, you want to be able to have those inflammatory cells rush to the site of injury and really heal that area. So what happens during this fight or flight that most of us refer to this as is that our bodies are actually creating an environment that is focused on survival, immediate survival. And so it's absolutely necessary that we have this response. And like I said, every animal has a similar response, including humans. But there's another side of that. And the other side of this coin is the parasympathetic nervous system. This is the rest, digest, and reproduce side. And the reason why these other zebras aren't running is because what happens in most species is that they can identify very quickly whether they're the ones in danger or if it's somebody else, right? And so these zebras have quickly realized that this poor zebra, baby zebra, is the one that is going to get caught by this lion. And so now they're just watching to see if he gets caught. Because if he does get caught, if that poor baby zebra gets caught, well, then these zebras know that they're safe, right? That this lion isn't going to come after them. And these zebras will go back to eating and digesting and doing all the things that they need to do to survive that aren't critical, right? So their heart rate will decrease, their blood sugar will go down, their levels of anxiety will go down. They'll start to digest food. They can go back to eating. They can go back to reproducing if that's what they need to be doing at this time. Whatever it is that is around resting, digesting, reproducing, they are free to do that. And the great thing about this collaborative picture is that they're either doing one or the other. They're not doing both. So what is actually happening? So I want you guys to follow me here. I'm going to give you a little orientation with this picture here, but once you see it and understand it, it will make sense. So this blue line is your parasympathetic, and this red line is your sympathetic. Remember, parasympathetic, rest and digest; sympathetic, fight or flight. So normally, before this lion came, the animals were probably eating and grazing. They were eating and just hanging out, not worried about much, and they were in their parasympathetics. But the moment that they saw the lion, they probably all started running. So their parasympathetic went down, and simultaneously their sympathetic, their fight or flight response went up. So you see them going in opposite directions because you can't be in both at the same time. You're either in one or the other. So initially they're probably all running until the lion decides who is the weakest of the pack, and it chooses this baby zebra, and then everybody else can go back to being normal. So their sympathetic goes down and their parasympathetic comes back up. And then they can just return to their normal state of being. This is a normal acute stress response. Now, this poor little zebra here is probably never going to go back to parasympathetic because if he gets caught, he will be dead. So it is really what should normally happen is if you survive this acute stressor, you should go back to being normal parasympathetic tone, back to resting, digesting. And why is this important? Why is this zebra lion story important to you? Because we do the same thing. So when you think about yourself in a stressful situation, so here this picture is to remind me of maybe walking or taking a run in a park at night, right? You hear something or somebody might be following you, your blood pressure starts to go up, you become nervous, and then you take off running because you are scared that there might be a threat. And then you find out moments later that really it was nothing at all, and then your sympathetic nervous system can go back down, and your parasympathetic can can take back over, and you can be calm as you walk home. Or if you are having other types of stressors, like going for a run, or getting ill, or eating high fatty foods, or high processed foods, or even drinking alcohol, all of these actions and many others can be acute stressors on the body. And our body is going to respond the same way that zebra did. The body does not know the difference between being chased by a lion or whether or not you were just going for a run or a jog, or if you have an illness. Your body's hormones and biochemistry is still going to respond in the same exact manner. Okay, so there's one other piece here that I want to bring up because I think it's really important. And I also think that as a woman, it's important that we recognize that research, when it is done, and we're looking at things like fight or flight and rest and digest, that when you don't study all of the population of humans, if you're not studying both men, women, non-binary, etc., you may not get a full picture. And this is the case with this concept of tend and befriend. So in the other two examples, when we talked about your sympathetic and parasympathetic, those systems are run by specific chemicals in the body. Sympathetic being run by your cortisol, which is a stress hormone. Your parasympathetic being run by your nervous system, a vagus nerve. But there's also another hormone that doesn't get a lot of talk, and that is oxytocin. And oxytocin is considered the love hormone. Now, the reason this is important is because as we studied the response of many women and how it differs from men, their stress response on a biochemical level and on a neurochemical level, we actually see some differences. We see that women tend to release more oxytocin, which puts them in a different or dampers down their fight or flight response or their cortisol levels. And instead, they tend to turn into a more of a tending or befriending sort of framework. So basically what that looks like is they tend to their young, so their children, or maybe look for communities to help get support. And this is just something that I think is quite interesting because it is a fairly new concept within the last, 20 to 30 years, actually, where we started to recognize that it's not just cortisol and the vagus nerve that explains everything that happens under the stress response. This oxytocin release is actually quite important. Now, with that being said, it does not mean that only women tend to their young, or that or look to be collaborative or supportive or look for social gatherings when they're under stress. It's just seen more frequently in women that they have more oxytocin released, and then there are also the effects that estrogen and testosterone have on your system as well. And estrogen actually upregulates oxytocin, where testosterone does the exact opposite. So again, interesting tidbit here, but if you find that when you are in a stressful situation that you tend to, rather than look for the fight or flight response, you tend to go into protective mode, sort of that mommy bear or daddy bear, if you tend to respond in that way, that is also a very biological way of responding. It's not just the fight or flight option. I wish we had more time to talk about this, but we can come back in the questions if anybody has some. So let's talk about why this has anything to do with your health. So what happens in chronic stress? So what we talked about then was an acute stressor, right? So something is happening to you that could potentially damage your life or cause harm to your body in the immediate future. But what happens when you're under chronic stress? And this is where it becomes problematic. Now, what does chronic stress look like? Well, it can look like a lot of things, and it's going to look different for everybody. And that is a whole other talk about perception and how you perceive the world around you, and how that has an impact on stress. We'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. But there are things that are just going to be stressful, right? Nobody is saying here that stress is bad. As I just talked about, stress is actually good. That response that you have in an acute stress response is actually quite good. But let's just talk about normal life, right? So what makes us different than the zebra and other mammals or other animals is that we have the ability to reason and think through and analyze in ways that other animals may or may not have. And so what ends up happening is that our day-to-day lives, which have become very complicated, can lead to us constantly feeling like we are under stress, right? So in this picture, it is this image that I love because it is the idea of, doing it all, right? I'm taking care of the baby, I'm cleaning, I'm cooking, I'm reading, I'm staying active, I am working, I'm doing all the things. And that in itself can be stressful, right? Depending on how you perceive these things. And doing them all at the same time, constantly having to think about it, worry about it, assess it. All of these things can be very stressful. Now, granted, this is just life as we know it, right? So we get used to doing it, and we don't really think of it sometimes as being a stressor. But our bodies over time begin to respond in that same stress response that we saw in the beginning. And rather than just sort of going back to normal, we're constantly feeling stressed. We're constantly doing the same thing day in and day out. And that can cause prolonged stress. But it's not just sort of these day in and day out things. There's also real stressors, right? There might be situations where you do, where your life is, feels like it's quite in danger. And it's not because a lion is chasing you, but it can be because of an argument that you have. It can be because you don't live in a safe neighborhood or you don't feel safe in your home. Maybe you have issues with parenting or being a child of aging parents, or all of the different stressors that are unique to you. All of these play a role in how your body on a chemical level responds. And the thing to realize about this is that your body's stress response is still the same. It's still exactly the same stress response. So we're going to look at the same image again, but now we're considering all of these other stressors that don't seem to go away, right? So here you are living your best life, and you're on this blue parasympathetic line, and then a number of chronic stressors intervenes, and you develop this sympathetic stress response. So let's just give an example here. Let's say that you're at work and you are just living your best life, and then your boss calls you into the office, and then there is something that went wrong, and now you feel on the defensive, and you're in a situation where there is an argument or there's a disagreement, right? We get really upset about it. Our body responds the same way it would respond under any other stressful situation, as if your body were going to, as if your life were in danger, right? Because our body can't tell the difference between a lion or an argument. And our cortisol levels spike, our stress levels go up. But what happens with us, us amazing humans who tend to be able to think and reason? Well, for some of us, that one argument lingers, right? It doesn't just go back down. It's with you for another week, another 2 weeks, another 3 weeks, maybe in a couple of years, right? And it's not just that argument, it's layered on with maybe the foods that you're eating, maybe the relationship you have at home, maybe the toxins you're being exposed to. All of these stressors just continue to pile up. These aren't stressors that are going away. And there might be stressors that are, in fact, in actuality, in real life, not going away, but then there are also stressors, the way we perceive them, that are not going away. And as a result, rather than our sympathetic nervous system coming back down and our parasympathetic nervous system taking over, what happens is that you stay in this high stress state. And that is chronic stress. And this is not just something that's happening in your mind, this is what's happening with the chemicals in your body. And so specifically, your cortisol levels will remain high. Your blood sugar can remain high. Your blood pressure can remain high. And what does that look like in real life? It looks like chronic disease, right? It looks like if you were in chronic sympathetic overdrive, it looks like muscle tension, digestive problems, constipation, mood changes, infertility, low libido, poor sleep, increased blood pressure or hypertension, increased blood sugar or diabetes, chest pain or heart attacks, anxiety, depression, recurrent illnesses, weight gain. And in the tend to befriend zone, that can also be problematic, because what if, your tendency, rather than to fight or flight, is to stay in situations that may not be healthy, or to be overprotective or hypervigilant in a way that is unhealthy, that tends to lead back to more stress. So what ends up happening on a chemical level is actually what's happening on a social level for us. And if we don't understand this and we allow it to just prolong, to go on and never get back into a parasympathetic rest, digest, reproduce state, then that's when all these problems begin to manifest themselves as disease. So what do you do about it? You want to go back and put yourself back into parasympathetic balance. So what does that mean? How do you do that? Well, here's the thing. Our bodies have gotten so used to chronic stress. And if we've never taken the time to actually learn how to bring ourselves back into a rest and digest state, then it's hard to do because we get into the habit of being stressed. And so the reason why I like to talk about this, and the reason why I talk about prescribing resiliency, our strategies to build your resiliency, is because it allows you to be intentional in a way that you might not be if otherwise in other situations, if you were left to your own devices. You think about in many cultures, the rest is baked into culture, right? So you might think meditation in many cultures, or therapy, or being in nature, or learning meditative or breathing techniques that help with stress. But if you haven't learned any of these, if you haven't developed healthy habits around bringing your cortisol levels down and increasing your vagus nerve or your vagal tone, or increasing your oxytocin, then what's going to happen is you're going to stay in a chronic sympathetic or stressed state. So the intention is around being able to balance this out by intentionally doing habits that bring your cortisol levels down. So what do those look like? So or better yet, this is more talking about what is the opposite of being in a chronic sympathetic state. What does it look like to be in a parasympathetic balance? So during parasympathetics, this is when your body heals. So if you've been injured, or if you have a cold, or if you've gotten sick, if you are highly stressed, your body is not healing. But if you are relaxed, your body heals better. You are more relaxed. You're not as tense. You have increased resilience, which just basically means that you can handle stressors when they come. So yes, all of us are experiencing stress, but whether and how we handle that stress, how we move on past the stressor, has to do with how resilient we are. Our mental clarity and creativity. So we've all experienced that when we are under stress, or we're anxious, or we're our cortisol levels are high, it's harder for us to think. We're not as creative. We can get very constipated, or have irritable bowel issues, or bloating. So those sorts of symptoms can worsen if you're in the sympathetic state. But if you're in parasympathetic balance, then digestion works the way it was designed to. Again, disease prevention. We talked about high blood pressure, diabetes, cancer, heart attacks. So you can prevent disease by balancing your nervous system. Improved sleep. So you sleep better when you are less stressed. Fewer infections. And your hormones, sex and thyroid hormones, function better when you are less stressed. You're able to lose more weight. So I have a whole entire program on weight loss. And part of that program is balancing your nervous system, because we know that if you are highly stressed, it is extraordinarily hard to lose weight, because cortisol actually increases the hormone that increases fat storage, which is insulin. So there are plenty of benefits of being in parasympathetic balance. But if you haven't figured out how to get yourself back there after being stressed out, then you will not reap these benefits. So what influences the things that trigger you? So I wanted to make sure I talked about this, because I don't want to lose sight of, or I don't want us to get confused about what stress is, right? And how we get triggered, because there are definitely situations that are just stressful and there's nothing you can do anything about, right? But the way you, regardless of the stressful situation, the way you perceive that situation will impact the way your hormones respond, and how your nervous system responds, and whether or not you are able to get yourself back into a parasympathetic state, or if you stay in a fight or flight sort of state. And so there are multiple things that contribute. So, and I've broken this up, and I honestly, I try to stay pretty scientific, and the following breakdown that I've put here on this slide is sort of my deduction from the research, but I don't know if there are any models that explain this better, but I will break it down the way that I have broken it down in my head. So there's intergenerational stress. Now, this is a very deep topic, more deeper than we have time to go into, but is the idea that what happened to generations before you, how that actually affects you today. And the science here is actually quite interesting. So that just basically is saying if your great-great-great-grandmother was stressed, that there were changes in her body that then could have translated into her children that were passed down intergenerationally. And so the evidence here is really interesting, but that is not something we can do anything about. So that's just something to be aware of, but it's not something that we can intervene upon. And then fetal exposure during stress. So what triggers you in your in your life today may be the result of something that happened when you were in utero, before you were even born. So that's the intergenerational trauma, but it can also be when when your mother was actually pregnant with you. And then there are personality things. So that if you have any children, then you know that your children come out and they are just sort of who they are. And they have some personality traits that are just unique to them, which may, be the result of intergenerational or fetal exposure, not necessarily due to stress, but just whatever makes a person's personality the way that it is. So those are things that you really can't intervene upon. But it is something, if you are thinking about having children, that's something that you can think about going into having children, and the way that how we treat our bodies during pregnancy and before we get pregnant. All right, so moving on to some other factors that may influence what triggers you. So childhood trauma. So the reason why I bring these areas up is not because it's something that you can change now. It is something that you can help influence in the children who are around you, but it's also something to think about when we talk about different treatment modalities and really addressing childhood trauma, recognizing that the things that trigger you today may be the result of something that happened before you can even remember. So that's where therapy comes in really well. The same thing with life experiences. I think your own personal life experiences shapes how you respond to the world around you, obviously. Culture and hierarchy. This is actually probably one of the most important factors when it comes to our perception of stress. So studies have actually shown that your perception of your status in a particular environment or culture has a huge impact on the way your body, the way you are triggered, or the way that your body responds to stress. So if you see yourself lower than those people, than others around you, if you see yourself poorer than others around you, that can have a huge impact on your perceived stress. Then if you are, let's say you're poor, but you're around a bunch of other poor people, you don't know that you're poor. That may not actually cause you to be very stressed out, right? So this is actually a really important one. I wish we had time to go into it, maybe another time. Your support system, so who's around you, obviously will impact the way that you respond to a stressor. So if you are in a group of people and someone attacks you, you feel much safer and may not feel as triggered as if you were by yourself and you were attacked by someone. Or vice versa. So, and then environment and exposure. So the environment that you're in, the things that you're exposed to, whether those are chemicals or behaviors, all of those things can play a role. All right. So the next thing that helps, that will influence what triggers you, are your skills and your strategies. And this is where the stress prescription comes in, because we can actually control how we respond to stressors. And again, this is not about getting rid of stress, because stress is good when it's healthy and not overwhelming, but then being able to put ourselves back. I want you to put that picture that I put up before of the stress response. Taking yourself from a sympathetic state to a parasympathetic state requires skills and strategies. because it's not intuitive, right? And some people are born who, I would always say, like, my father is one of those people that nothing bothers him. And he has, for the past 80 years, had great skills and strategies to deal with them, with stressors. And then other people you've met who are hyper reactive. It doesn't matter what's happening, that a person could have a neutral looking face and they see that person as being threatening, and they're just hypersensitive. So developing skills around our own personality, around our own childhood traumas, around our own cultural perceptions, developing skills that help address these really is going to make a huge difference or impact on those chemical levels as well as your health. So this is where we get into your activity. So this is prescription number 1. And so what I'd like you to do, if you have a sheet of paper, you can, and a pen, you can keep that by you, but I'd like you to close your eyes for a minute, and I want you to think about what types of things stress you, or what are your triggers? What types of things trigger a stress response in you? And that can be a person, a place, or a thing. I want you to focus on just one thing that might trigger you or cause a stress response in you. And I want you to think about that one thing, and I want you to see if you can identify why that stressor triggered you. What about the situation might have triggered you? So I'll give you an example for me. And this is just a social example. So one of the things that I always notice, or when I think about this, the one thing that stands out to me, it's a situation where if I'm working and I'm really, really focused on something, if someone comes over and interrupts me in the middle of my working, I get triggered. I can, feel it in my body. I get really short. I can be quite rude sometimes. And I try to limit that. Now, when I think about why do I respond that way? Why do I get all worked up if someone interrupts me? Well, that's because for me, when I am focused, it's hard for me to get back on task. So when there is something triggers me, because I know that the consequence, I fear or I worry that I'm not going to be able to get back focused after the disruption. And so this is really important for me to know, because the reality is I don't want to get triggered every single time my kid walks into the room and I'm doing something, right? I don't want to lash out anytime someone comes in and says something while I'm in the middle of working. But I can, number one, I can observe the fact that this is happening. I can observe the way it makes me feel. I can observe the emotion that's associated with. I can observe the thoughts that come into my head when this happens. And this is sort of the first step of really understanding how often you're triggered, the types of things that trigger you, and it's the first step to figuring out what you do about it. So after you have figured out what that stressor is and you have assessed why you get triggered, the next thing I want you to do is I want you just to be an observer in your body. Observe how your body feels, observe your thoughts, and observe your emotions. And even if you can't figure out why something triggers you, you can still observe how it feels in your body. This is really important because what you're feeling, what you're thinking, actually is lending to that sympathetic response, right? So that tension that you feel in your shoulders, or that cramping that you might feel in your belly, or the fatigue or the brain fog that comes after, all of those are can be the result of high cortisol levels and high stress response. Okay, so again, this is just an activity for you to first assess what's going on, and we'll talk about what you can do about those feelings, that emotions, those body, that discomfort in your body, in just a moment. So what we want to do is we want to take that feeling, number one, recognize that we're in there, because here's another thing that I find is that oftentimes sometimes people don't even know that they're stressed, right? And I want to look at you when I talk about this. So sometimes And I'm sure that all of you guys have probably experienced this one time or another where you are constantly just doing the things, all the things that you think you're supposed to be doing. Cleaning the house, running errands, going to work, picking up kids after school, walking the dog. And all of this is so normal that you don't realize that at the same time as you're doing all of these things, that your shoulders are getting tense, that you might be having GI discomfort, but you don't know why. You might be having fertility issues and you don't know why. You might be developing a chronic illness and you don't know why, right? In medicine, we call these sorts of symptoms that we can't pinpoint what the cause is as idiopathic. But I would venture to wonder whether or not this isn't idiopathic. It's not that there isn't a cause. It's just that we aren't accepting or acknowledging the cause that we know is there, which is stress, right? So that's why the previous activity is really important. Is number one, recognize when you are stressed, okay? Then you have to understand, how do you shift back, right? So this is shifting to a parasympathetic balance. So this is an intention, right? Because if you're feeling, tense, or if you're feeling overwhelmed or burnt out or stressed, if you don't intentionally pull yourself back, recognize that you're stressed and pull yourself and say, okay, what can I do to lower my cortisol levels and increase my vagus tone? I know that sounds kind of crazy because I'm sure you're not thinking about it in that way, but a better way of maybe saying that is, how do you relax? If you haven't figured out, okay, how do I take myself from being tense to relaxed, then you'll stay tense by default, right? So how do you do that? So I talked about that vagus nerve is actually being what drives your parasympathetics. Well, your vagus nerve is actually connected to your diaphragm. Your diaphragm is the muscle that helps you breathe. So when you take deep breaths, it actually helps to calm or pull on that vagus nerve and tells your body to calm down. And this makes sense, right? Because think about it. When somebody is usually anxious or upset or stressed, they tend to breathe shallow and quick, right? But when you slow down your breath, it tricks your brain into thinking, oh, I'm no longer in a stressful situation. The lion is no longer chasing me. It says, I am safe. So I'm sure you've heard this before when people have probably said when you're stressed or anxious to just take a deep breath. But that's the reason. It's because it actually calms your vagus nerve. So I also talked about that hormone oxytocin. So how do you do that? Hugs, kisses, love, affection. So if you're a person who's not a hugger, who's not an affectionate person sometimes, you may get your oxytocin in other ways. But it does help to have human touch, right? Or even if it's an animal, if it's your dog. So having, loving environments, being around people who are loving and compassionate towards you, helps to release oxytocin, which helps to calm you back down. And so this, again, when we think about childhood trauma, when we think about old experiences where we may not have received a lot of love and affection in the past, how that may affect how your body responds to stress now. So doing things like walking in nature and surrounding yourself with peace and calmness, being mindful or being more present in the moment. I talk about this. I learned it as pairing your nervous system. So essentially pairing your nervous system with the activity you're actually doing. So if I'm eating, I don't want to be still thinking about the argument that I had 10 minutes before. I want to really be thinking and being mindful about what I'm eating, because that will help me relax. But if I'm still worried about something that happened, an hour or 3 months ago, then it's going to keep me in a very tense state when I should be resting and digesting. And so it can affect digestion if you're not actually pairing your current activity and your emotions at the same time. So doing something you enjoy, so having fun, being out in nature or gardening, resting and sleeping. So these are two separate things, right? So sleep is actually closing your eyes and your body actually shutting down and going into a certain brain wave, which is considered sleep. But you can actually rest with your eyes open or closed. That can look like meditation. It can look like just sitting and being quiet. It can look like closing your eyes but being awake. This is actually very restorative, and it actually can, in fact, bring you back into a parasympathetic state. There are a number of things that you can do. Obviously, you want to pick the ones that resonate with you. So if you're not a person who likes nature and nature actually brings you anxiety, obviously that would not be the one for you. So I don't want you to think that getting back into a parasympathetic looks like one specific thing. It looks like whatever relaxes you. Just like whatever makes you stressed is going to be different than what makes someone else stressed, what relaxes you is going to be different for everyone as well. So let's talk a little bit about that. Let's assess what your current skills and strategies are for handling stress, right? So the first step to that is identifying the habits, behaviors, or skills you use when you feel stressed. And you may think about this question and realize you don't have any skills or strategies. And if that's you, you are in luck because we're going to talk about some. But if you have some already, again, let's not recreate the wheel, right? Let's figure out if those strategies are effective or if there are things you could do to improve upon those strategies, right? So the first is identifying the habits or behaviors or skills. So for me, deep breathing works, right? When I would go see patients in the hospital, going from one room to the next room, I would take a couple of deep breaths in between rooms because I would need to calm myself from one room to the next, because sometimes what's happening when people are sick, it can be very stressful for them, but it can also be stressful to me as their provider. And so I don't want to take that stress from one room to the next. So breathing, I found, was actually quite relaxing for me. Meditation also works for me. It took me a long time to learn how to meditate in a way that seemed effective, but once I got the hang of it, it was very relaxing. Also, yoga works for me. So those are just strategies that work for me. You need to identify ones that work for you, and I'll give you some examples next to think about if you're struggling. And then you want to think, okay, how effective is that? So, for example, with me going from one room to the next and taking a deep breath, did I actually feel relaxed when I went between rooms? Sometimes I did, sometimes I didn't. And that's where meditation came in. I had to level up my strategy, because what I found is if I only tried to address stress when I was in it, in the middle of it, then it wasn't as effective as if I were doing things on a constant day-to-day basis that helped to build my resilience, that helped me manage stress even when I wasn't stressed, right? So it became natural and normal for me to be in the parasympathetics instead of the sympathetics. So I would start meditating or doing yoga or taking walks or talking to friends to make sure that even when I was in a stressful situation, I didn't automatically get triggered so easily, that I actually had a little bit more buffer because I had been doing these practices. So you want to think about, are the strategies that you have, are they effective? And then the third step is going to be, what are you willing to do to enhance your current response or create more effective responses? So if you find that what you're doing isn't working, or if you don't have any strategies, can you do something? Can you add something to your strategies? And what might that look like? So here are some ideas. Obviously, there are more than this, and that's the great thing about us as humans, is that everybody's different. We all have different things that work for us. The key is figuring out which one works for you. So as you look at this list of things, you can identify maybe one or two that stick out to you that you could start to employ, or things that you see that you're already doing really well that you might want to enhance. So just for your record, EFT is emotional freedom technique. That's tapping, for any of those of you who may be familiar with that. TCM is traditional Chinese medicine. So there are lots of options here. Okay, so the last part of this talk is not really a talk, it's a challenge. It is the action steps that you can start to employ. And I want to sort of walk you through my framework so you can see exactly how you can start to prescribe yourself strategies to help manage stress. So I have provided a nice little checklist here. for you to do. It's a 5-day challenge, so pick a week and decide when you want to start to employ some of these things. But the way that it's broken up into those categories I talked to you guys about in the beginning: personal life, food life, resilient life, sleep life, and fit life. And obviously there are more than this, but these are a good place to start. The way you do this challenge is that every single day you try to do as many of the things on this list as possible, and you just check it off per day. And then you make observations over the course of the week, how that really affected the way that you feel, maybe the way that you're responding to stress around you. But let me go through them quickly so that you can see what I'm talking about. So again, this is the People's Life prescriptions, and we are doing 5 of the 6 that are here. So personal life has to do with being the best version of yourself. So it is, what are you doing every day for yourself that shows yourself self-love? How reflective are you being about how your day has gone? Have you been actively working towards forgiveness of others or yourself? Doing acts of service or really restorative emotions, and compassion and gratitude are also there. So on your checklist, I think 4 or 5 of these are here. You can add in some in the line that was left available to you if you want to add something else in here. But you want to try to do something that reflects one of these, of each of these every single day. Food life has to do with feeding your neuroendocrine system. So that is basically making sure that your body has the right nutrients for these hormones. So remember, stress is not in your mind, it's in your biochemistry. And so if you're not giving yourself the nutrients your body needs to create the hormones and that your body needs to be at peace, then you will have more stress in your life. So what is a diet that is associated with less stress? So that would include less processed food, eating more vegetables because they have more nutrients in them that your body needs, eating clean fats and proteins. So this just means things that are without toxins or preservatives, limiting refined grains like cereals and pastas, and then boosting your coffee or tea with adaptogens. I'll talk a little bit about adaptogens at the end. Resilient life, so I talked about my breath work and meditation, but also being present and mindful, we talked about. And then rest, sleep, restorative emotions. Restorative emotions basically is similar to what we did earlier where we closed our eyes and we thought about something that made us feel stressed. You can do the same thing, but think about something that restores your energy. So love, kindness, gratitude, compassion. Think about emotions that really restore the way you feel, and that actually can shift you to a parasympathetic tone. Sleep is also super important, so you can try this out as well for 5 days. So no screen times 2 hours before bed. I know that's going to be hard for those of you who like to watch your phone or thumb through TikTok in the middle of the night, but this actually really helps with sleep. Eliminating overhead lighting before bed, so that's using lamps or blue blocking lights at nighttime after the sun goes down. Being in bed by 10 p.m. and with the intention of getting 7 to 8 hours of sleep. I know many of you night owls like to stay up late and work the midnight hour and sleep for 3 to 4 hours, but that will actually increase your overall stress levels. Getting morning sunlight, going outside, getting some sunlight first thing in the morning actually helps to balance your cortisol levels. And then sleeping in complete darkness and in a cool room actually really helps with sleep. So Fit Life is all about movement. So doing things you actually enjoy, walks in nature we talked about, stretch breaks. So just if you're a person who's sitting at a table all day long, just getting up and moving your body, and working out first thing in the morning. It's also a really great way to build your resistance. And that doesn't have to be anything intense. It can be a walk in nature. So what are some supplements? There are tons of them, but some of the ones that come to mind, the simplest I think of is a high quality multivitamin, B vitamins, vitamin C, magnesium, and fish oils. Again, you can get all of this from food, or you can take them in the form of a supplement. And then I wanted to make sure I added in some botanicals, because there are specific botanicals that have been shown to help balance your stress neuroendocrine system. And those are called adaptogens. And so there are some of my favorite I put here. Ashwagandha is really good. Reishi, rhodiola, cordyceps, and green tea is not an adaptogen per se, but it does have components of adaptogens in them. So this is my daily dozen, the things I try to do every single day that include the things we talked about. So I try to do some form of movement that brings me joy, whether that's dancing in my house or going for a walk with my kids, something that makes me happy. Try to meditate every day. Really foster healthy relationships with, people I love the most. Doing a gratitude journal. I don't do this every morning, but it's something that, when I do it, it really helps to put things into perspective for me and helps my day start off really well. Time in nature. I know you've seen that many times, and because it's actually been studied to show that it helps to decrease depression and anxiety. Deep sleep. So that's not just going to sleep, but it's ensuring that you're getting good deep sleep, which means going to bed before 10 o'clock. I wish I had time to go into that, but you get better sleep when you go to sleep at least before 10. Eating lots of plants, having a bowel movement every day, being not holding in my thoughts or my emotions, but speaking my truth, staying well hydrated, getting sunlight, and journaling to get some of my thoughts out. So these are just a way to incorporate some of these healthy habits, how to prescribe health for yourself. I hope that you have some ideas about ways that you can start to implement healthy behaviors into your life. And I'm so excited to have had this talk with you guys. I hope if you have any questions, you will put them in the comments. With that, you can follow me at Peoples Functional Medicine on any of the socials. I'm mainly on Instagram, and I'm just starting a YouTube channel. So those are my favorite social resources. Or you can go to my website, drnicolepeoples.com, if you want more information about me and my practice. All right. Talk to you guys.